Thinking Aloud. Conversations on the leading edge of knowledge and discovery with psychologist Jeffrey Mishlove.
Hello and welcome. I'm Jeffrey Mishlove. Today we're going to look at a very interesting portion of Indian history. I'm talking about the Indian subcontinent. We're going to discuss the Bengal Renaissance. With me is Professor Debashish Banerji, who is the Haridas Chaudhuri Professor of Indian Philosophies and Cultures. He is also the chairman of the Department of East-West Psychology at the California Institute of Integral Studies in San Francisco. In addition, he is author of Seven Quartets of Becoming, which is his interpretation of the yoga psychology of Sri Aurobindo, and he is the editor of a new anthology called Posthumanism and Planetary Futures. Welcome, Debashish.
Thank you, Jeff.
It's a pleasure to be with you once again. Now, I think it's fair to assume that most of our viewers will have very little concept of what I'm referring to by the term, the Bengal Renaissance. So maybe we should start by identifying where in time and space we'll be focusing.
Sure. So the Bengal Renaissance is the name given to a movement of cultural politics, actually a cultural renaissance in India, in the eastern state of Bengal, which is adjoining the nation of Bangladesh. All of Bangladesh, as well as the part in India, which is west of Bangladesh, was Bengal when India was colonized by the British. And Bengal became the capital of the British in India in the 18th century. And once they set up a kind of a commercial empire, one may say, in India, they started trading from Bengal, and they needed natives to be middlemen for the work that they had to do in getting raw materials from the hinterlands, and also the various kinds of establishments they needed in India.
This was known as the British Raj.
The British Raj, that's right. And so that particular class of Indians, of Bengalis, became Europeanized, or they learned English ways, and they started a culture of their own. This culture was very interesting because it was neither an imitation of the British, nor was it an entire sort of rejection of the European Renaissance, of the European Enlightenment, or the values that the British brought. And so the culture that they formed over the 19th century was a culture of assimilation and reform, but also a culture of the critique of the West. And that has been called the Bengal Renaissance.
And the dates, roughly, I gather this was over an extended period of time.
Yes, it really runs over almost the whole of the 19th century and into the period of India's struggle for independence, which starts at the beginning of the 20th century and goes till the middle of the 20th century.
Mm-hmm. So I think 1947, wasn't it?
To 1947. Really, the political part of it goes from about 1905 to 1947. Mm-hmm. But its precursor is a cultural politics that prepares the political movement. And the Bengal Renaissance is a very important, sort of preparation for that. Mm-hmm. That happens over the 19th century.
It's fair for our viewers to know that some of your ancestors were among the most prominent people who are identified with the Bengal Renaissance.
I suppose you're talking about the Tagores.
Yes.
And the Tagores I'm related to the Tagores from my maternal side. Mm-hmm. But yes, the Tagores were very prominent in this cultural movement as an entire house. that started in the 19th century. The sort of patriarch of that house in a certain northern part of Calcutta, which was really the Indian part, the native quarters. Calcutta, like other colonial towns, was split into a white town and a black town. So the white town was where the British lived, and the black town was where the Indians lived. And that area developed its own kind of character and its own culture. And these people that we are talking about, who were the elite class that emerged due to transactions with the British, took on the name Bhadralok, which can be translated as gentlemen. And this class of people had settled homes in the northern part of Calcutta. So that house was, the patriarch of that house was somebody called Dwarkanath Tagore, who was a contemporary and the best friend of someone called Ram Mohan Roy, who you might have heard of.
Ram Mohan Roy,
yes.
The founder of the Brahmo Samaj.
That's correct.
A very important religious movement.
That's right. That's one of the really important strands of the Bengal Renaissance. And Dwarkanath Tagore's children and his succeeding generations were extremely illustrious contributors, creative people who contributed to this movement we are talking about.
So I gather that the patriarch was, who you're describing, was in a sense a merchant.
He was a middleman. He started off by dealing with the British, and then he started his own enterprises. So he was an entrepreneur. One of India's first really prominent native entrepreneurs. And the money that he amassed, he also owned land, could support the creative activities that the others in the family were engaged in. Of course, the most important and well-known person in that family is Rabindranath Tagore,
who received the Nobel Prize in literature.
In 1914 in literature, correct.
And I can show for our viewers right now, I happen to have, I think I've shown it to you before, a photograph. I got it from the photographer who took this picture of Rabindranath Tagore with Albert Einstein at the Waldorf Astoria Hotel in New York, and a meeting of Nobel laureates that took place in 1947. Obviously, as a Nobel laureate poet, is a man of enormous cultural influence.
Sure, absolutely. And extremely cosmopolitan, very well informed of what was happening in the world, both in East and West. Very well traveled. And so he's a quintessential Bengal Renaissance man, almost like a Leonardo in Bengal.
If you see the photo, which our viewers are seeing, he looks like a sage. He looks like a very wise person. And in his face, it's as if all of the wisdom of ancient India is being expressed through this man.
Which is really interesting because in a way, it is a reinvention of the traditional, sort of sage that we are seeing in Tagore. But also, one has to look at it as a construct because I would say that he is a kind of sage, but at the same time, he is presenting himself as a sage in terms of the kind of dress that he's wearing, his makeup, etc. It's a form of what one might call sartorial politics.
Theater.
A kind of theater. Theater as politics.
And this is your great-granduncle, is he not?
He is, yes. So, and during that period, we come across a number of figures like that. Even Gandhi, for that matter, who is not a part of the Bengal Renaissance, was really presenting himself in a certain way.
Yes.
Both physically as well as mentally and through his expression.
And his simplicity of dress was part of that.
That's right.
Because he rose to extremely high positions in society where people didn't normally dress that way.
That's quite true. And so we find that this begins in the Bengal Renaissance. People invent themselves just as they're inventing their tradition. And they're also positioning themselves vis-a-vis the West. And they're trying to, I would say, the real importance of the Bengal Renaissance is that it presents an alternative modernity, that it tries to position itself in a certain way that critiques, not entirely rejects, but accepts and critiques the values of Western modernity that are being brought into India through colonialism.
And at this point in time, I may believe the British had been ruling India for a couple of centuries.
Yes, right. About 100 years. In Bengal, about 100 years.
Okay.
Yeah. So, from the mid 18th century, they really gained power in Bengal. And then, the Bengal Renaissance as a cultural movement begins from early 19th century. And by the mid 19th century, it's really in full swing. Yeah.
And it differed, I gather, from other parts of India.
Yes, you're quite right, Jeff. I think what is happening is that there are certain other parts of India that are prominent in having some kind of a reaction to the British. For example, we find Maharashtra and Gujarat. Gandhi comes from Gujarat, but Gandhi becomes active only in 1920s. So, but earlier, around the time that late 19th century, you find people like Bal Gangadhar Tilak and others in Bombay and Maharashtra that are voicing their critique of the British. But nothing as substantial as the Bengal Renaissance as a cultural movement is generated in these other parts. So I think this is a very important point, because what it means is that there is a lot of popular thinking that arises that gives the possibility of a kind of a new culture. If that doesn't happen, just politics by itself can get freedom for the nation, but people have not really thought about what it means for them culturally.
When I was a child, my only exposure to India at all was, watching programs on television. I think they had something called Rama the Jungle Boy or something of that sort. But I remember references over and over again on these TV programs to the Bengal Lancers.
Right.
They were very crack group of Indian soldiers who were part of the British Army.
Quite.
And so I assume from that in Bengal, the British influence was stronger than elsewhere.
That's true, because that became the capital of the British. They came into trade. They had settlements in other places by the time they came to Bengal. But once they came there, they made it their capital, and so they needed a strong army, and they had barracks in Bengal, as in other places. And of course, they collected a strong army over there as well.
But and enlisted the native Indians into that army.
That's right. Yes.
And who performed, from all accounts, brilliantly.
Sure.
Yes. So that's part of the cultural ambiance.
That is also part of the entire cultural ambiance.
And at the same time, after a century of colonialism, the people who are becoming increasingly more sophisticated are yearning for self-rule.
That's right. And so there's an entire spectrum of attitudes towards self-rule that is generated by the beginning of the 20th century. There is, on the one hand, the sense that certain things about the British are good. For example, the equality of all human beings. That became a value that was embraced by the thinkers of the Bengal Renaissance, and became one of the foundations of a reform movement.
As opposed to the caste system.
then there was the notion of cosmopolitanism and plurality, which also became one of the things that was embraced by the Bengal Renaissance largely. I think the other side of it was that home rule, that the need for freedom, the need for a cultural identity of their own. Yeah. So one of the really strong things that was the contribution of the Bengal Renaissance was a literary movement that allowed the Bengali language to really take shape and become modern. In other words, this has happened in other places as well. You find this in Japan, for example. How do you take a traditional language, a vernacular, and make it modern so that you can actually, engage with modernity on your own terms? So this happens in Bengal due to a strong literary movement. And so some of them felt that, freedom could come through cooperation and through reform, through moderate means. But more strongly, I think the feeling grew in Bengal that the British needed to be fought. So it was really a double-edged movement. On the one hand, by the time we come to the beginning of the 20th century, you have people like Sri Aurobindo, Aurobindo Ghosh, who's also part of the Bengal Renaissance in that sense, who is claiming that for the masses, one needed civil disobedience, non-violent movement, boycott, and indigenous manufacture, things like that. But for those who were ready, an army needed to be prepared. And then there were others like him who said that terrorism was necessary. Extremist, violence was necessary. So there was an entire spectrum of attitudes on how to arrive at independence.
And now we referred earlier to Ram Mohan Roy and the Brahmo Samaj, which is, to my knowledge, an effort to take ancient Hindu traditions and in effect modernize them. Let's talk about that.
Right. So the Brahmo Samaj is a reform movement within Hinduism that started by Ram Mohan Roy. And then important proponents of it are Dwarkanath Tagore's son and Rabindranath Tagore's father, Debendranath Tagore, and also others like Keshav Sen, who became a close person in the circles of another very important figure of the Bengal Renaissance, Swami Vivekananda, and his teacher, Sri Ramakrishna. So you had a kind of an extremely close, intimate circle of personalities that were generating this movement. So the movement that Ram Mohan Roy started was a kind of a reform movement in which all the idol worship and the superstitions and the various kinds of ritual that were engaged in Hinduism were swept aside, and a kind of more impersonal Hinduism that was based in the Upanishads was proposed as a more universalist spirituality, a kind of a kind of Unitarianism within Hinduism. So I think this movement became quite popular, and I think it represents part of this need to become universal, to arrive at a kind of a foundation for a plural culture within Bengal. So that was going on, but that was also closely connected with a very strong, another kind of pluralism within Hinduism, which was represented by people like Sri Ramakrishna, who was a mystic, and actually integrated in himself, all the various Hindu sects, one may say, saw them all as, opportunities for spiritual realization. And I think, the movement that grew around him also came into contact with the Brahmo Samaj. And so there was a very interesting spectrum of attitudes towards spirituality that made for a kind of universalism there as well.
Now, Ramakrishna is, to my knowledge, today regarded as a great Hindu saint.
Sure, yes. A great saint and mystic. Founder of, I think, he's known even better because of his famous disciple, Swami Vivekananda, who came to the West and traveled a lot, wrote a lot.
And also a wonderful biography of him for Western readers was written by Christopher Isherwood, who was a well-known novelist, friend of Aldous Huxley,
Absolutely.
and who wrote, as I remember, the novel upon which the famous play, the play Cabaret, which takes place in Germany, and that was also the novel upon which the play was based, was written by Christopher Isherwood.
I see. Yeah.
So he's a very prominent writer who also wrote about the life of Ramakrishna.
Yes.
And Ramakrishna, to my understanding, also was known for violating all sorts of other social norms.
Absolutely. Yes. He was a completely, God intoxicated person in our times that found his way to have God realization in any way that was given to him, including religions like Christianity and Islam, and all the various sects within Hinduism, like Tantra. One could say he was primarily a tantric, but through Vedanta, Tantra, Vaishnavism, and even things like Christianity and Islam, he could find spiritual realization, which in a way demonstrated this plurality that we are talking about.
If I recall correctly, he sometimes was known to dress in women's clothing.
Sure. That was part of traditional practice within Vaishnavism. And so he took up all these traditional practices and practiced them to their extreme. And in each case showed how they led to a spiritual realization. Not necessarily the same, but for him, each one of them was a name and face of God.
And he established an order of swamis.
He didn't establish the order of swamis, Jeffrey. He remained a householder all his life. So he was really a everyman in that sense. But it is Vivekananda, his disciple, who I believe he needed legitimization, in the name of some kind of ancient order, and so started the order of monks, of swamis.
Vivekananda did. And then Vivekananda traveled to the United States, where he became celebrated as an emissary of the Hindu tradition to the West, really the first Hindu spiritual teacher to have an enormous influence in the West.
Quite true. He brought the teaching of Vedanta. He wrote a lot. And I would say he is one of the founding figures of the introduction of yoga as a kind of almost a philosophical system, yoga philosophy, to the West.
So, and there were also artists involved.
Yes, indeed. It was a literary movement, an artistic movement. There was an entire school, the Bengal School of Art, that was born out of this, at the head of which was one of the Tagores, Rabindranath's nephew, Abanindranath Tagore, who generated that entire, was the founding figure of the art movement.
And how did this art differ from previous movements?
So, like the rest of these cultural movements, there was a political element to it. So what had happened to Indian art at that time was that, it had been devalued. I mean, the traditional sources had been, atrophied. And so, people were, the traditional schools of the past had become, absorbed into the royal courts. Now to do naturalistic painting. So they were painting ethnographic scenes, portraits, draftsmen's, plans and things like that. So it had become more utilitarian, and it was serving some of the needs of the British for tourism, for ethnography and things like that. But the older streams of Indian art had dried up. So the Bengal school partially, some people think of it as a revivalist movement, but it was more like a reinvention of some of the principles of the past. At the same time, it was an engagement with modernity. So it was a attempt to create a kind of a new Bengali identity in art.
And I should point out to our viewers, you've written a book about
that's right.
Abanindranath Tagore's art. He was your great-grandfather.
My maternal great-grandfather. That's right. And yes, I've written a book called The Alternate Nation of Abanindranath Tagore that looks at his art as a form of nationalism that's very nuanced, that in a way resists the stereotyping of art at the service of creating a national identity. Because as cultural politics, art, like literature, becomes utilized to create the symbols of the nation, which he was involved in doing. But at the same time, he was involved in dismantling or deconstructing those symbols so that there was an openness to the kinds of identities that could be absorbed, the same notion of plurality in cultural identity.
Now, what was once the state of Bengal has gone through enormous political turmoil in subsequent years. It became divided. At one time, it was part of India, part of East Pakistan.
That's right.
Then Bangladesh revolted against West Pakistan and established itself as a separate nation. So now the former state of Bengal is two different nations, and
That's right.
and with a large Muslim population as well. But I gather the Muslims and the Hindus were both contributed to the earlier Bengal Renaissance movement.
That's right. There were, Muslim writers as well, like Qazi Nazrul Islam, who was a Muslim, a Bengali Muslim. And when the British divided Bengal, actually they first divided Bengal for administrative reasons in 1905. And that's when the entire freedom struggle erupted. One could see that as the, historical moment for the beginning of the freedom struggle in Bengal. Though earlier than that, in 1857, we have the first War of Independence, as it's been called, with the army revolt, the revolt within the army. But the Bengal Cultural Revolution, which was really preparing a political revolution, saw an opportunity to become active in 1905 when that administrative partition of Bengal took place. But later, and during that time, you had Muslim figures like Qazi Nazrul Islam and others that participated in the Bengal Renaissance. But this would be a simplistic kind of portrayal, because there was at the same time a faction of Bengali Muslims who felt that they were better off if there was the partition in East Bengal. They wanted the security of a Muslim state.
Yes.
So when, India became independent, the British divided India into the subcontinent into India and Pakistan. And one wing of Pakistan was in Bangladesh and the other wing was in West Pakistan.
Separated by a great distance.
Separated by the entire, landmass of North India.
Yeah.
It was East Pakistan and West Pakistan. So East Pakistan was East Bengal, really. Again, the same partition, was now nationalized and made into part of Pakistan. But when East Pakistan revolted against West Pakistan, they did so in the name of Bengal. They did so in the name of a linguistic community as against a religious community. So that was very interesting in the sense that they considered themselves to be first Bengalis and then Muslims. And it's in that with that idea that they became free and took the name Bangladesh and took as their national anthem a song by Rabindranath Tagore. Though their national poet was Qazi Nazrul Islam, who really was a figure of the Bengal Renaissance. So, of course, I mean, as I said, these are complicated movements. And to this day in Bangladesh, there is a kind of a strong, divide between people who think they're Bengali first and really children of the Bengal Renaissance and people who think that they're Muslims. See, so there is a Muslim extremist kind of faction in Bangladesh. And in West Bengal, I think the legacy of the Bengal Renaissance is in the fact that there is a much greater sense of community, and there is a greater sense of cosmopolitanism. I'd say the ideals of the Bengal Renaissance became quite distributed. Some thinkers would say among the middle class, but some thinkers feel it didn't go deep enough into what are called the subaltern people. That's a questionable notion. I mean, of course, politically, once India became free, Bengal saw many years of communist rule. And one of the good things that happened is that the disenfranchised, the poor, became more, came to the forefront a little more.
Some elevation of the very lowest elements of society
happened, and education came to a much larger number of people
under communist rule in Bengal.
And I think what has happened as a result is that sense of fraternity that was created by the Bengal Renaissance could spread a little more. But at the same time, the Bengal Renaissance has to be seen in its own moment as a certain kind of experiment that has a limitation in time, space, and social class. Over time, what has happened is that right now, as we speak, elections are going on in Bengal. And the right-wing political party that is, very popular all over India, the Bharatiya Janata Party, is gaining greater stronghold. May not win, but is gaining a greater stronghold in Bengal. And they represent a kind of more nationalistic Hinduism. Which has never been able to take hold of Bengal in the past because exactly of this more universalist and pluralist notion of the Hindu or even of universal spirituality that was generated by the Bengal Renaissance.
Now, the idea of universal spirituality seems to be a centerpiece of the Bengal Renaissance.
Quite true, quite true. And you can see it. I mean, all the figures we are talking about were in some way spiritual figures as well. Whether Ram Mohan Roy or Ramakrishna, Vivekananda, Debendranath Tagore, Rabindranath Tagore, Bankim Chandra Chatterjee, a great writer, Sri Aurobindo, they have all been really prominent spiritual figures and thinkers, Swami Vivekananda, but they all espoused a kind of cosmopolitanism and a pluralism, a universalism in religion.
In other words, the message would be that one can attain some of the highest peaks of mystical exaltation, ecstasy, states like the traditional state of samadhi without having to subscribe to all of the rituals and customs and folklore of the native religion.
That is true, but I'd say that that would be one aspect of it. And on the other hand, there would be people who would say one could embrace all the rituals and customs of different sects and cults and not be limited by them. Mm-hmm. You see, that's the more inclusive idea.
Yeah.
And I think that the more inclusive kind of universalism is represented by people like Ramakrishna, who embraced all traditions, tried to put on the trappings of those traditions, and yet was not limited by them, could use them as masks to arrive at a certain experience, and then give them up for other masks through which he could arrive at the experiences they gave. And I think he could affirm that a spiritual transcendence can be arrived at through all these means and more. So I think there's an interesting term that gets sort of redefined in the Bengal Renaissance through a few of these figures. We find it in Ramakrishna, in Vivekananda, and later in Sri Aurobindo. It's the term Vijnana. And the term Vijnana, in its more ordinary sense, means science. But in its more spiritual sense, it's an Upanishadic term. Jnana means knowledge.
Yes.
Gnosis, Vijnana is a qualification of knowledge. It means specific knowledge. So the term Vijnana is used by Ramakrishna first to refer to, a kind of a sort of a knowledge organ of God, one may say, through which God can present its infinite riches in infinite ways. You see, so the infinite consciousness can know itself in infinite ways. So that, and he gives a very beautiful, simile or metaphor for this. He says, a parable rather. Somebody came to a tree and found a chameleon and went back and said that I saw this really strange animal, colored green on the tree. And so the person he spoke to went there and saw the same chameleon, but it was colored brown. And he came and started fighting with him and said, I saw a brown animal there. And so then a third person came to adjudicate and saw a red chameleon there. And so now, they were all fighting with each other. Then they went back together to that tree. And now they saw a blue chameleon, all of them. So there was somebody sitting under the tree and he said, this is my home. I sit here. And they asked him, what color is that animal? And he said, well, that's a strange animal. It takes a different color every day. So he gives this parable to define the word Vijnana as the point of view of the person who sat under the tree, who therefore knew the plurality of the manifestations of God, while those who came from different traditions could only see one view. Sri Aurobindo uses the same term Vijnana to refer to the chameleon's consciousness of itself. In other words, one could become the chameleon and know its own infinite powers of expression. So I think it's these ways of understanding spirituality in plural terms that characterizes this movement.
Now, I don't want to dwell on this too much, but I've been told, maybe you know something about this, that Sri Ramakrishna also in his writings referred to the use of cannabis for spiritual purposes.
I know that, for example, Sri Aurobindo talks about the fact that he experimented with cannabis and hashish and things like that for a period of time and saw their uses to attain to certain states of altered states of consciousness. And an interesting comment he makes, and think of this is happening way before the 60s. he said that it intensifies the ability to enter into contact with the words of music.
Which is often how it's used these days as well. But I don't want to digress too much on this point, but I understand that amongst the sadhus in India, hashish and cannabis were commonly used for spiritual purposes.
Are used to this day.
Yes. And have always been.
Yes, indeed.
So that's another wrinkle in the cosmopolitan culture of India.
Yes.
We don't need to push it any further than that, I don't think. Well, this has been quite an interesting journey. What would you say for people today, for our viewers? What value is there in knowing about the Bengal Renaissance?
I think, firstly, it's interesting that it's called the Bengal Renaissance. And a good friend of mine, Michael Murphy, that you probably have.
The founder of the Esalen Institute.
That's right. He thinks of he uses this term, the Bengal Renaissance, and he uses it, he thinks of it as almost a parallel for Florence in the Italian Renaissance.
I see.
He feels Calcutta in the early 20th century was a parallel of Florence during the Italian Renaissance. But I think the real legacy of the Bengal Renaissance was its critique of modernity. Its own alternative modernity based on its own assimilation of Enlightenment values. And I think the lesson it teaches us is exactly that from our own traditions, we ought to absorb certain values of the Enlightenment, like the value of the equality of all human beings, the value of plurality, of cosmopolitan globalization, not globalization, but a cosmopolitanism. But at the same time, we ought to, bring into engagement our own traditions into modernity.
Well, when you mentioned Michael Murphy, he's a person extremely important in the development of what was known as the human potential movement in the 1960s, 70s, 80s, 90s. The Esalen Institute had an enormous impact throughout the United States. He was very much inspired by Aurobindo.
He definitely was. And I think this whole notion of the human potential movement is also something that we can see in the Bengal Renaissance, the exploration of human potential through culture and through psychology.
Well, Debashish Banerji, I'm so glad that you've shared this with me. I've learned a lot. I hope our viewers have as well. It gives a real context to the struggles of people around the world and how that has impacted us here in the West.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Thank you for being with me, and thank you for being with us. Thank you.